Rome did not yet know what to do with the silence. Not the literal silence. The city was never truly quiet, never without its vendors and cartwheels, and the distant clatter of workshops beginning their day. But beneath the ordinary noise of that morning after, there was something else entirely, the feeling of a great absence arriving all at once, pressing down on the streets and the forums and the colonnaded walkways where men had, for years, watched for him. His body had fallen in the theatre of Pompey, not in some ancient royal hall, but in a political meeting place of the Republic, under a ceiling meant for deliberation rather than bloodshed. Senators had gathered in their bordered togas, petitions had been expected, rituals of speech and procedure were meant to unfold as they had on so many other days. Instead, there was confusion in the chamber, and a stunned city trying to understand what had just happened. The man who had crossed rivers, subdued provinces, written about his own campaigns with elegant confidence, and gathered more power into his hands than any Roman of his age, now lay still. By then his face was already known everywhere that Rome's authority reached, in Italy, in Gaul, in Spain, in Greece, in Egypt, in the ports of Africa, in the markets of Asia Minor. People had heard his name spoken with admiration, fear, resentment, gratitude, hope, or exhaustion. To some he was the restorer of order, to others the destroyer of liberty. To many he was both. It is one of history's enduring patterns that certain men become too large for the institutions that first produced them, and then too difficult for those institutions to contain. Yet before all of that, before the battles and the reforms, before the laurel wreath and the statues and the accusations, there was only a Roman boy, born into an old but financially modest patrician family, growing up in a city where ancestry mattered, reputation mattered, and ambition mattered perhaps most of all. The Rome that shaped him was already restless. Its old customs still stood, but they stood uneasily, like weathered columns bearing more weight each year. To understand the life of Caesar is to move through that restless world slowly, from its aristocratic houses and sacred rituals to its tribunals, military camps, and uneasy assemblies, and finally to the moment when one man's rise became inseparable from the fate of the Republic itself. That journey begins long before the Ides of March, in a city that had spent generations teaching its noblest sons how to seek glory, but not always how to stop. Julius Caesar was born in 100 before the Common Era, though even in antiquity exact dates could gather a little uncertainty around them. He entered a city already old in memory, yet still young in its appetite. Rome had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean, not through a single moment of conquest, but through centuries of persistence, stubborn discipline, opportunism, and adaptation. By the time of his birth, it ruled vast territories, extracted taxes from distant peoples, and summoned armies on a scale earlier Romans could scarcely have imagined. Its temples, forums, and public buildings testified to success. Its politics, meanwhile, testified to strain. He belonged to the gens Julia, an ancient patrician family that traced its mythical descent to Iulus, the son of Aeneas, and therefore, in the imaginative genealogies Romans loved, to the goddess Venus herself. Such claims were not simple fantasy to Roman aristocrats. Myth, ancestry, and public life were deeply interwoven. A family's past was displayed in funerals, in portraits of ancestors, in speeches, and in names repeated across generations. To be born into such a lineage meant inheriting expectation before one understood its cost. Yet old blood did not always mean present power. Caesar's family was noble, but not among the wealthiest or most dominant in the political world of his youth. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served as praetor and held respectable office, but he was not one of the towering figures of the age. His mother, Aurelia, came from a distinguished family and seems to have been remembered as intelligent, capable, and dignified. Ancient writers, who so often neglected women unless scandal compelled notice, speak of her with unusual respect. In many ways, it was in such households, guided by careful women behind the more visible careers of men, that Roman public life was quietly prepared. The district in which he was raised, the Subura, or nearby environs according to some accounts, was no serene enclave removed from the city's roughness. It was dense, noisy, crowded, and alive with trades, shrines, smoke, and human friction. If he did spend his earliest years close to such a neighbourhood, then the future dictator did not first know Rome only as marble and ceremony. He knew it as ordinary Romans knew it too, a place of narrow streets, cramped dwellings, market smells, and endless movement. His childhood unfolded against the background of one of the Republic's most bitter internal struggles. In the decades before his birth, Rome's social tensions had deepened under the pressure of empire. Wealth flowed into the city, but unevenly. Military commands brought glory and riches to some, while poorer citizens struggled with debt, land loss, and political marginalization. Reformers, such as the Gracchi, had tried and failed to address some of these imbalances. Violence entered politics more openly. Faction hardened. Men who claimed to defend tradition often used extraordinary means, while men who called themselves champions of the people could be equally ruthless. Two great political currents shaped the world of young Caesar. The optimates, broadly speaking, the defenders of senatorial authority and aristocratic custom, and the populares, men who sought power by appealing to the assemblies and tribunes of the people. These were not modern parties with neat boundaries. Roman politics was more fluid, more personal, and more dependent on patronage, rivalry, and opportunity. Even so, the distinction mattered. Caesar's family connections leaned toward the popular side. His aunt Julia had married Gaius Marius, the celebrated general whose victories against foreign enemies had made him a hero to many, and whose conflict with Lucius Cornelius Sulla would plunge Rome into terror. Marius was a figure of immense importance in Caesar's early world. He was not a patrician grandee of old stock, but a new man whose rise had disrupted aristocratic expectations. He had held the consulship multiple times and reformed aspects of Roman military practice. To admirers, he represented talent over birth, force of will, and service to the people. To enemies, he represented dangerous ambition and a politics of resentment. The contests between Marius and Sulla would do much to teach an entire generation what Roman power could become when rivalry escaped customary limits. In childhood, Caesar would have absorbed these things not as abstract constitutional principles, but as household realities. Families remembered insults for decades. Weddings signalled alliances. Names carried echoes of triumph and exile. A Roman boy of aristocratic standing was taught to read, to speak clearly, to memorize, to observe religious forms, and above all to understand that public life was the proper stage upon which male excellence was displayed. But behind such training there was also fear. One could fall. One's relatives could be proscribed, banished, ruined, or killed. His father died when Caesar was still young, likely in his mid-teens. Such a loss mattered greatly in Roman society. The father was not only a parent, but the legal and moral head of the household, the transmitter of name and standing. Without him, a son could find himself at once more vulnerable and more independent. In Caesar's case, this early death may have sharpened his reliance on his mother's side of the family, and perhaps strengthened his own precocious sense that life was uncertain and rank alone offered no shelter. By adolescence, he had been nominated to the priesthood of Jupiter, the office of Flamen Dialis, a highly prestigious but restrictive religious role. The post came with honour, but also with numerous taboos that would have limited military and political freedom. It is one of the many revealing features of his early life that he did not remain enclosed within that sacred framework. The politics of the time would soon sweep aside such prospects. Sulla's victory over the Marian faction reordered Rome violently, and the old paths available to a young nobleman were abruptly altered. When Sulla marched on Rome and established his dictatorship, he demonstrated something new and dreadful. A Roman general, backed by his own soldiers, could seize the city itself. Lists of the proscribed were posted. Enemies were stripped of property and life. Fear became administrative. The Republic still had magistrates and ceremonies, but its legal shell had been broken and used as a weapon. Caesar, connected by marriage and kinship to the Marian cause, came under suspicion. His early marriage to Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, another Marian leader, placed him still more squarely in dangerous company. Sulla demanded that he divorce her. Caesar refused. The refusal has often been remembered as an early sign of unusual firmness, even of theatrical courage. Ancient anecdotes are rarely free from polishing, and one must always read them with care. Yet whether the scene unfolded exactly as later writers described or not, the broad truth is meaningful. As a very young man, he chose not to save himself by repudiating a politically inconvenient wife. This decision cost him his priesthood, his inheritance, and his position. For a time, he went into hiding, moving through the Italian countryside, dependent on sympathizers and bribes. Some accounts speak of narrow escapes, illness, and intermediaries who persuaded Sulla to spare him. Sulla, it is said, warned that in this young Caesar there were many Mariuses. Whether he truly spoke those words cannot be known. Still, the line endured because it felt plausible. Something in the youth was already visible to older men of power. A dangerous composure, a refusal to bend easily, and an ambition that did not announce itself crudely, but did not disappear either. Thus, his early life was shaped by contradiction from the beginning. He was born noble, yet not secure, connected, yet endangered, marked for religious dignity, yet drawn instead toward political and military action, raised inside the mythology of the Republic, yet formed in an age when that Republic was repeatedly violated by its own guardians. It was a hard inheritance, and it taught its lessons early. Once Sulla relented, or at least ceased actively pursuing him, Caesar entered the uncertain years that turn a Roman aristocratic youth into a public man. These years were not merely transitional. They formed habits of body and mind that remained visible throughout his life. He learned how to move among powerful men without becoming their dependent, how to use speech as an instrument, how to endure hardship without appearing burdened by it, and how to cultivate an image without seeming entirely artificial. These are old arts in politics. Caesar learned them early. He began military service in Asia Minor, a respectable and often necessary beginning for young men seeking a future in Roman office. Service in the provinces exposed Roman aristocrats to a wider world than the city's rituals and arguments. There were Greek-speaking cities with old philosophies, kings who negotiated with caution and resentment, tax systems, local elites, coastal harbours, and landscapes full of older civilizations over which Rome had laid its command. For a mind as active and adaptive as his, this must have been instructive. Rome ruled, but it did not erase. Everywhere it encountered traditions older than itself, and peoples whose obedience was never simple. During his service, he took part in the siege of Mytilene and is said to have won the civic crown for bravery, one of Rome's most respected military honours. If the details are partly embroidered by later admiration, the larger point remains. He did not live as a sheltered noble youth coasting on ancestry. He sought distinction, and distinction in Rome still required visible courage. An episode often repeated from these years concerns his capture by pirates while travelling in the eastern Mediterranean. The story is famous because it fits the Caesar of legend so neatly. Taken by Cilician pirates and held for ransom, he allegedly behaved not like a frightened captive, but like an offended superior. He joked with his captors, complained when they were noisy, composed speeches and poems for them to hear, and when they set too small a ransom upon him, insisted they ask for more, as if they had underestimated the value of the man they held. Most memorable of all, he told them calmly that once freed, he would return and punish them. After his ransom was paid, he did just that, though some accounts suggest he ordered a swifter end than others might have chosen. Like many ancient stories, this one was probably burnished over time. Yet it endures not merely because it is dramatic, but because it expresses something essential. It presents a young man already convinced of his own scale. Even in danger, he treated himself as someone temporarily inconvenienced, not fundamentally overthrown. That confidence, almost theatrical yet somehow practical, would become one of the defining tones of his life. When he returned to Rome after Sulla's death, the political environment had shifted, though not into peace. The old dictator was gone, but the precedents he set remained. Ambitious men had seen what force could do. At the same time, the institutions of the Republic still operated enough that a man of talent could rise by legal means. Caesar chose the public path of advocacy and office. He studied rhetoric, likely under the famous teacher Apollonius Molon at Rhodes, and developed as an orator. In Roman political culture, eloquence was not decorative. It was a weapon, a credential, and a means of shaping reputation before large audiences. Ancient observers compared his speaking style to others of the age, and often found in it a certain grace, clarity, and force. He was perhaps not the greatest orator of the generation in the eyes of all critics, for Cicero occupied a singular place in Roman eloquence, but Caesar spoke effectively and with polish. More important, he understood how speaking and writing could reinforce one another. He was one of those rare political men who not only acted, but narrated his own actions in a manner others were compelled to read. In these years, he also pursued the sequence of public offices expected of an aspiring Roman statesman, the cursus honorum. He served as military tribune, questor, aedile, pontifex maximus, and praetor. Each office brought duties, visibility, and chances for advancement. None of them, however, was secured by merit alone. Elections required allies, favour, money, memory, and spectacle. Caesar proved skilled at all of these. Debt became one of the most important facts of his early rise. To modern eyes, it can seem paradoxical that a man burdened with enormous obligations should continue climbing. Yet Roman public life made this almost predictable. To win office, one needed games, feasts, generosity, building projects, and a household capable of impressing peers and pleasing crowds. Caesar spent lavishly, sometimes recklessly, on public entertainments and urban display. As curule aedile, he staged games of such magnificence that people remembered them. He restored monuments associated with Marius, carefully signalling continuity with the popular memory that Sulla had tried to erase. He bought affection and notice, but he did so strategically, not merely out of vanity. There was calculation in his debts. He borrowed because he believed future glory would justify present risk. A lesser man might be crushed by creditors. Caesar instead made indebtedness part of forward motion. Wealthy backers, most notably Marcus Licinius Crassus, saw enough promise in him to intervene at critical moments. Crassus was immensely rich, politically astute, and eager to cultivate clients who might serve his interests. The relationship between the two men was not simple affection. It was mutual use in a society built upon such exchanges. His private life, in these years, also reflected the pressures and customs of Roman aristocratic existence. After the death of Cornelia, he married Pompeia and later Calpurnia. Marriage among the elite was deeply political, though not devoid of personal feeling. Caesar's domestic life, like that of many Roman nobles, ran alongside public obligations rather than apart from them. His household, his guests, his women, his daughters, and later his heirs, all formed part of the social fabric from which politics was woven. One of the most revealing moments of his maturation came in 63 before the Common Era, when he sought the office of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priesthood of Rome. It was an audacious bid for a relatively young man. The office carried prestige, residence in the Forum, and a sacred authority that reached into every corner of civic life. He campaigned for it heavily and borrowed even more to do so. On the morning of the election, he reportedly told his mother that he would return either as Pontifex Maximus or not at all. He won. This victory mattered far beyond religion. In Rome, sacred office and political capital were inseparable. Public life rested on rituals, omens, calendars, and institutions under divine sanction. To become chief priest was to step closer to the symbolic center of the state itself. Caesar was still not supreme in politics, but he had become impossible to overlook. As praetor and then governor in further Spain, he continued to expand his reputation. The Spanish command gave him military experience, administrative responsibility, and, crucially, an opportunity for wealth through victory and provincial operations. There is a famous anecdote from this period that, while passing a statue of Alexander the Great, he reflected with sorrow that Alexander had conquered much of the known world by the age at which Caesar had done comparatively little. Ancient writers loved such stories because they cast ambition in clean symbolic form. Whether he literally wept before Alexander's image or not, he certainly measured himself against extraordinary standards. These formative years reveal something steady beneath the variety of offices and episodes. Caesar did not drift upward. He shaped his ascent deliberately. He cultivated boldness without open recklessness, popularity without surrendering aristocratic bearing, intellect without appearing bookish, and extravagance without losing all practical control. He was not yet the man who would dominate the late Republic, but the outlines had emerged. He knew that Rome rewarded brilliance, memory, and daring, and he understood that old rules could be stretched by those confident enough to survive the strain. By the late 60s and early 50s before the Common Era, Caesar was no longer a promising young aristocrat. He had become a central figure in Roman politics, though not yet an unchallenged one. Rome at this point was governed less by stable institutional balance than by the uneasy coexistence of a few enormous personalities. The Senate remained the formal heart of the Republic. Magistracies still rotated annually, and elections continued. Yet beneath these forms, power increasingly clustered around men whose military achievements, wealth, and client networks outmatched the ordinary machinery of office. Three such men came together in an arrangement that later writers would call the First Triumvirate: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. It was not an official constitutional body. It was a private understanding among ambitious men who saw advantage in cooperation. Pompey Magnus was the most famous general of his generation, admired for Eastern victories and grand stature. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, a financier of immense influence. Caesar was the youngest of the three, but perhaps the most agile politically, able to bridge resentments and negotiate outcomes others could not secure alone. The alliance was born from blockage. Pompey wanted land settlements for his veterans and ratification of his Eastern arrangements. Crassus wanted relief for tax contractors and greater political leverage. Caesar wanted the consulship and, beyond that, a command that would extend his power beyond the annual limits of office. The Senate, wary of all three in different ways, hesitated or resisted. Caesar recognized that separate frustrations could become shared purpose. In 59 before the Common Era, he won the consulship. His fellow consul, Bibulus, became almost an emblem of obstruction, trying to impede measures Caesar favored. Yet Caesar drove legislation forward through assembly, public pressure, and alliance politics. His consulship was controversial, aggressive, and effective. Land laws were passed. Pompey's interests were advanced. Crassus gained what he sought. To strengthen ties further, Caesar gave his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey. This was not merely domestic arrangement. It was the binding of factions through family, one of Rome's oldest methods of securing political peace. At the end of his consulship, he secured a proconsular command in Gaul and Illyricum, later expanded to include Transalpine Gaul. This command would transform his life and Rome's future. Provincial governorships were often opportunities for enrichment and modest prestige. Caesar's became something else entirely, a theatre of conquest, administration, self-presentation, and the forging of a military loyalty more personal than republican custom could easily accommodate. Gaul was not a single unified nation waiting to be conquered. It was a broad region inhabited by many tribes and federations, linked by trade, rivalry, custom, and shifting alliances. Roman influence had touched parts of it already, especially the southern corridor that connected Italy to Spain. Yet vast areas remained outside direct Roman control. Migration, tribal conflict, and pressures from Germanic peoples east of the Rhine created a fluid and unstable frontier. Caesar moved into this world with the alertness of a man who recognized opportunity in complexity. His campaign against the Helvetii in 58, before the Common Era, was presented, in his own later account, as a necessary defensive action to prevent a dangerous migration through Roman allied territory. There was truth in this, but also art. Caesar's Commentaries on the Gallic War is a masterful work of political prose, composed in a plain, controlled style that conveys inevitability and reason even when describing acts of immense aggression. He wrote about himself in the third person, a choice that seems modest on the surface but in practice deepens authority. The narrative voice appears calm, rational, and above mere ego, even as it carefully constructs reputation. The war widened. He fought Ariovistus, a Germanic king whose presence in Gaul Caesar framed as a threat too near the Roman sphere. He campaigned season after season, moving through forests, across rivers, into tribal territories, building camps, negotiating with local leaders, punishing resistance, and rewarding submission. Roman military organization, engineering, and discipline gave him great advantages, but victory was never effortless. Supplies had to be managed, winter quarters secured, intelligence gathered, cavalry coordinated, and allies maintained. To govern war on this scale required not only bravery, but administrative stamina. As the years passed, he achieved feats that astonished contemporaries. He bridged the Rhine, a gesture as symbolic as it was strategic, demonstrating that the great river was no barrier beyond Roman reach. He launched expeditions to Britain, not full conquests, but bold extensions of Roman arms into lands that occupied the edge of Mediterranean imagination. These ventures enhanced his prestige at home, even when their practical outcomes were limited. Caesar understood spectacle as well as logistics. The image of Roman standards, where none had stood before, mattered politically. At home, meanwhile, his alliance was beginning to fray. Julia's death removed a personal bond between Caesar and Pompey. Crassus, always a balancing force between the two, sought military glory in the east and died disastrously at Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era, against the Parthians. With Crassus gone, two giants remained where three had once balanced one another. The Republic, which had already been adjusting itself uneasily around their power, grew still more unstable. In Gaul, the greatest test of Caesar's command came with the revolt led by Vercingetorix, an Arvernian nobleman who managed, however briefly, to unify many Gallic tribes against Rome. The uprising of 52 before the Common Era revealed both the depth of resentment Roman conquest had generated and the continued fragility of Caesar's hold. Towns burned, supplies were threatened. The war turned harsher. Vercingetorix adopted scorched earth tactics, understanding that Roman armies depended on food, movement, and local submission. The campaign culminated at Alesia, a hilltop stronghold where Vercingetorix and his forces were besieged. Caesar's response was among the most remarkable engineering efforts of ancient warfare. He built lines of fortification facing inward to contain the besieged, and outward to resist the relieving forces expected from the surrounding tribes. Ditches, ramparts, traps, towers, and walls of timber and earth enclosed the hill in an immense ring, then another. For those inside Alicia, there was hunger and dread. For those in Caesar's camp, there was strain, sleeplessness, and the constant possibility of being overwhelmed from both directions. He held. The relief effort failed. Vercingetorix surrendered. This victory did not merely end a revolt. It confirmed Caesar as perhaps the greatest living commander of Rome. His men had fought with him for years across difficult country. They knew his habits, and he knew theirs. He marched with speed, endured hardship, remembered names, praised bravery publicly, and displayed a controlled courage that soldiers found reassuring. He could be demanding and severe, but he was not distant. In war, proximity matters. Caesar gave the impression that he shared danger rather than merely directing it. At the same time, every triumph in Gaul intensified fear among his political enemies in Rome. He had acquired wealth from conquest, glory from victory, and loyalty from hardened legions. He also had time. Provincial command extended his immunity from ordinary political vulnerability. As long as he remained with his army, he stood beyond the reach of prosecutors who might attack him the moment he returned as a private citizen. Thus, his climb to prominence produced a new kind of deadlock. The more successful he became abroad, the less safely he could return home. Rome had created a system in which elite competition could be managed as long as men alternated office, command, and private status according to custom. Caesar's greatness made that rotation dangerous to him and intolerable to others. What had begun as opportunity was becoming crisis. The years in which Caesar reached the height of his influence were not limited to military success. His historical significance lies partly in conquest, certainly, but also in what he did with power once he had gathered it. He was not simply a general who won battles and basked in their memory. He was an organizer, a writer, a legislator, a planner of colonies, an adjuster of calendars, and a man who grasped that authority must be translated into structures if it is to outlast a campaign season. The immediate problem, however, was how to move from Gallic Command back into Roman politics without submitting to destruction. The Senate, influenced heavily by Pompey and by men hostile to Caesar, pressed for him to give up his command. Caesar sought compromise, asking to retain certain protections or to stand for office in absentia. The dispute was legal in form, existential in substance. Once he laid down imperium and entered the city as a private man, prosecutions could begin, allies could evaporate, and the years of conquest could be reinterpreted by enemies in whatever terms suited them. In 49 before the Common Era, he crossed the Rubicon, the small river marking the boundary beyond which a governor could not legally bring his army into Italy. The phrase associated with that moment, that the die was cast, has echoed through centuries. The action itself, though, was probably not theatrical in the way later imagination prefers. It was a decision made within a framework of deep calculation and growing inevitability. He knew what civil war meant. So did his opponents, yet they all moved toward it nonetheless. Pompey and many senators fled Rome, eventually regrouping in the east. Caesar entered the city not as a wild destroyer, but with remarkable speed and purpose. He sought legitimacy, filled offices, managed supply, and presented himself as the restorer of order against a faction that had made ordinary politics impossible. Here again, his genius for narrative accompanied action. He did not describe himself as overthrowing the Republic. He depicted himself as defending his dignity, his lawful standing, and the rights that enemies had trampled. Civil war took him across the Mediterranean world. He campaigned in Spain first, wisely seeking to neutralize Pompeian forces there before the larger confrontation in Greece. His dictum that he was going to fight an army without a general before fighting a general without an army captures his preference for strategic sequencing. He moved quickly, pressed advantages, and trusted audacity when slower minds hesitated. The decisive contest with Pompey came at Pharsalus in 48 before the Common Era. Pompey commanded a larger force and retained the prestige of earlier greatness. Many senators had attached themselves to him as the defender of the Republic against Caesar's overreach. Yet battle is not won by prestige alone. Caesar's veterans, though outnumbered, were disciplined and experienced. When the armies met, his tactical adjustments and the steadiness of his men carried the day. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was killed upon arrival by courtiers seeking to ingratiate themselves with the victor. Caesar's reaction to Pompey's death appears to have been genuinely complex. The two men had been allies, relatives by marriage, and rivals. Pompey's severed head, offered as a gift, represented not only political convenience, but the end of a world they had both inhabited. Roman civil war had consumed one of its greatest figures in a petty and humiliating way. Caesar reportedly turned away in grief. Whether every detail is exact or not, the broader truth rings clearly enough. Even victors in civil war inherit bitterness. In Egypt, he became entangled in the dynastic struggle between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Alexandria, with its palaces, harbours, Greek institutions, and ancient Egyptian kingship beneath Hellenistic polish, offered a setting very different from the camps of Gaul. There, politics was courtly, multilingual, ceremonial, and dangerous in subtler ways. Caesar supported Cleopatra, and from that alliance emerged one of antiquity's most enduring relationships, though later Roman moralists and propagandists would clothe it in all kinds of suspicion and fantasy. Their connection mattered politically and personally. Cleopatra was intelligent, educated, and determined to preserve her throne in a world increasingly shaped by Roman decisions. Caesar, meanwhile, found in Egypt both strategic necessity and perhaps a form of companionship that appealed to his cosmopolitan intelligence. He helped secure her position after the Alexandrian War, and their association produced a son, Caesarion, according to Egyptian claims, though Rome would never accept that child as his legitimate heir in the Roman sense. From Egypt, he moved on to further campaigns. At Zela, in Pontus, he defeated Pharnaces swiftly, giving rise to the famous terse report, "I came, I saw, I conquered." The phrase has survived because it expresses both speed and style. Caesar understood the power of compression. A whole campaign could be reduced to 3 verbs and still seem sufficient. He fought in Africa against remaining Pompeian forces, then in Spain against the sons of Pompey. Civil war did not end neatly because one battle had been won. Roman elite resistance had deep roots, and each defeated faction could still produce another army elsewhere. Caesar's later campaigns were therefore less about opening new frontiers than about exhausting opposition across the already Roman world. They were, in some ways, more sorrowful than the Gallic Wars, because the enemy now was not tribal confederation or foreign king, but Roman after Roman. When he returned to Rome as undisputed master, he accumulated honours on a scale that troubled even some supporters. Dictator for 10 years, then dictator in perpetuity, multiple consulships. Extraordinary distinctions in dress, seating, titles, and statues. His face appeared in ways Roman sensibility had once reserved more cautiously for living men. The line between magistrate and monarch, never formally crossed, grew thinner in public perception. Yet these honours were only one side of his rule. The other was reform, and here his energy was remarkable. He enlarged the Senate, though critics saw this as dilution rather than improvement. He reorganized local government, addressed debt in measured ways after the disruptions of civil war, planned and founded colonies for veterans and the urban poor, extended citizenship more broadly in some directions, and sought to regularize administration across a sprawling empire that old republican habits had managed imperfectly. One of his most enduring reforms was the calendar. The Roman calendar, before Caesar, had become badly disordered, manipulated for political convenience, and drifting away from the solar year. With advice from Egyptian astronomers and scholars, he introduced the Julian calendar in 46 before the Common Era, aligning civic time more closely with astronomical reality. It is a quiet sort of achievement compared with military conquest, but perhaps more lasting. To regulate the year is to touch daily life in a way no triumph can. Festivals, contracts, taxes, harvest expectations, religious observance, and ordinary human planning all depend upon time made reliable. He also envisioned grand building programs and urban improvements. Rome, for all its glory, often lagged behind the scale of its empire in administrative coherence and physical order. Caesar imagined a city more worthy of imperial command, more open, more monumental, better organized, less dependent on inherited clutter. Some of these plans remained incomplete at his death, but they reveal a mind not content merely to dominate old structures. He wanted to redesign them. His intellectual gifts remained visible even amid power. The commentaries, both on the Gallic War and the Civil War, stand as literary achievements of unusual control. Their surface plainness hides immense craft. He selects detail with care, presents decisions as measured necessity, and turns military complexity into lucid prose. In doing so, he shaped not only contemporary opinion, but the later memory of his own life. Few rulers have narrated themselves so effectively. At the heart of his influence, then, was a rare combination: commander, propagandist, legislator, and symbolic figure all at once. He could found a colony, reform the calendar, pardon an enemy, dictate letters while travelling, inspect troops, receive embassies, and compose lines of prose that made all of it seem orderly. This breadth impressed admirers and alarmed opponents in equal measure. Great power is one thing, great power joined to restless competence is another. No life that rises as high as Caesar's can remain uncomplicated, and his contradictions were visible even to those who loved him. He was capable of clemency, but also of great severity. He could be charming, urbane, and unexpectedly patient, yet he could also be cold in the service of ambition. He admired Roman tradition and skillfully wrapped himself in its language, but he repeatedly forced that tradition to accommodate forms of personal authority it had not been built to endure. The conquest of Gaul remains at the centre of these contradictions. To Roman eyes, it could be celebrated as glory, security, and expansion. To modern eyes, and indeed to many ancient ones if they had spoken from the other side, it was also a massive war of subjugation. Entire communities were uprooted, towns were destroyed. Captives were sold into slavery in enormous numbers. Caesar's own figures in the commentaries are often debated and may be inflated for effect, but even with caution, the scale of suffering was immense. His prose, so calm and elegant, often describes destruction with administrative restraint. That too is part of the contradiction. Civilization and brutality are not always opposites in imperial history. Very often they travel together. Then there was his relationship to debt, generosity, and corruption. Roman politics cannot be measured by modern standards of clean administration, and it would be simplistic to isolate Caesar as uniquely compromised in a broadly compromised system. Still, he pushed the use of money, patronage, spectacle, and political maneuver further than many of his peers could comfortably accept. He borrowed prodigiously, spent magnificently, rewarded followers, and built a network in which personal obligation blurred with public responsibility. Admirers saw largeness of spirit, Critics saw appetite without restraint. His clemency toward defeated Roman enemies became one of the most discussed aspects of his rule. He pardoned many former opponents, including men who would later join the conspiracy against him. Compared with the proscriptions of Sulla, this looked noble and humane. It probably was, in part. Caesar seems to have preferred reconciliation to bloodshed where practical. Yet clemency can also be a form of domination. To spare an enemy is to place him in one's debt, to remind him that his life now continues by another man's choice. Some senators accepted pardon gratefully. Others found it humiliating. The Republic had once rested on a rough equality among elite citizens, however imperfectly practiced. Under Caesar, even mercy proclaimed hierarchy. His personal conduct offered further material for admiration and scandal alike. He was known for elegance in dress, careful grooming, and a concern for appearance that some traditionalists mocked. He was widely rumoured to have had numerous affairs. Ancient political culture revelled in sexual insult, and much that was said about him cannot be treated straightforwardly as fact. But his involvement with Cleopatra, at the very least, gave his enemies ample opportunity to accuse him of Eastern luxury, monarchical temptation, and estrangement from Roman austerity. In Rome, moral language was often political language in disguise. There was also the question that hovered over everything in his last years. Did he want to be king? Rome had expelled its kings centuries earlier, and the memory of monarchy remained one of the Republic's most sacred taboos. Yet words can conceal, while symbols reveal. Caesar accepted honours that looked suspiciously regal. He sat while receiving delegations when some thought he should stand. He wore triumphal dress, at times not strictly traditional. He was offered a diadem in public, which he refused, though the whole scene only deepened suspicion. Statues among kings, temples proposed to the clemency of Caesar, and the month Quintilis later renamed July in his honour, all created an atmosphere in which constitutional precision mattered less than emotional impression. It is possible that Caesar himself did not imagine what he was doing in the crude terms of kingship. He may have believed the Republic incapable of governing its empire without permanent concentration of power in exceptional hands. He may have seen himself as correcting a system already broken by generations of rivalry and violence. Many reformers, after all, come to think that only they can complete the necessary repair. Yet from the perspective of men raised to believe that liberty meant not being ruled by one superior will, his rise looked intolerable regardless of his intentions. His relationships with fellow elites were therefore increasingly strained. Cicero admired aspects of his intelligence and style, but remained uneasy. Brutus, whom Caesar favoured, embodied in his lineage and public persona the republican virtue that conspiracy would later invoke. Cassius was bitter, capable, and distrustful. Even men who benefited from Caesar's generosity could not easily settle the question of what their own dignity meant under his supremacy. There was also the subtler contradiction of exhaustion. Caesar had lived at a pace very few men could sustain. Years of campaigning, political tension, administrative burdens, and constant public performance wear even the strongest temperaments. Ancient sources describe episodes of ill health, perhaps seizures, and various bodily weaknesses that did not prevent achievement, but do complicate the image of effortless energy. He was not an iron mechanism. He was a man in his 50s, whose body had carried extraordinary demands. And still he planned more. Campaigns against Parthia, perhaps reforms yet unfinished, perhaps an empire still only partially shaped to his design. This, too, reveals the contradiction. He had risen so high that rest may have become impossible. Great men in history sometimes lose the ability to imagine themselves outside movement. If they stop, the emptiness beneath ambition threatens to become audible. Thus, the burden of greatness in Caesar's life was not simply that others envied him. It was that his gifts produced conditions no ordinary constitutional arrangement in Rome could easily survive. He could not become smaller, and his rivals could not accept what he had become. Even his virtues sharpened the conflict. His mercy offended, his energy intimidated, his brilliance justified his confidence, and his confidence, displayed too visibly, made him dangerous. The final phase of Caesar's life was filled with motion, yet it carries a strangely still quality in retrospect. This is often the atmosphere that surrounds the last months of powerful men. Plans continue. Decrees are issued. Invitations are accepted. Courtiers and petitioners come and go. Yet around the visible machinery of rule, another current begins to gather, one made of rumour, hesitation, wounded pride, and the private speech of men who have convinced themselves that only one terrible act remains. By 45 and early 44 before the Common Era, Caesar had returned from his final campaigns against Pompeian resistance in Spain, including the hard-fought battle at Munda. That victory effectively ended organised opposition in the field. He came back to Rome as the unquestioned master of the Roman world. Public honours multiplied. Celebrations were offered. His image appeared with growing frequency in civic and sacred contexts. Offices and titles pressed upon him until the boundary between magistracy and personal sovereignty looked nearly dissolved. Outwardly, this might have seemed the moment of greatest security. Inwardly, it was perhaps the moment of greatest isolation. There is something lonely about supremacy in a republic. A king inherits hierarchy as a principle. A dictator in a city that insists it is free must live amid perpetual contradiction. Every gesture is read twice, once by supporters and once by enemies. Every pardon raises suspicion. Every appointment alters a balance. Every visible sign of honour can be interpreted either as gratitude or as warning. Caesar's circle remained full, but the space around him had changed. There were flatterers, petitioners, loyal officers, practical administrators, old friends, and wary aristocrats. There were fewer true equals. His household life in these years retained some structure of ordinary Roman continuity. Calpurnia remained his wife. His great-nephew Octavian, still very young, had begun to receive notice, though few could have guessed how decisive that quiet youth would become. Cleopatra's presence in Rome for a period caused comment and discomfort, reminding the city that Caesar's world now exceeded old Roman boundaries in ways that seemed both dazzling and disquieting. Meanwhile, he continued to plan a campaign against Parthia, the eastern power that had destroyed Crassus and stood as the one major rival that Rome had not yet subdued. Such a campaign would have suited him greatly. A vast enterprise, military and symbolic, capable of carrying him beyond the stale resentments of Roman civic life and into a theatre where conquest might again unite ambition with public purpose. Preparations advanced, departure approached, and for the conspirators this created urgency. Once Caesar left with armies again, and perhaps returned with yet more glory, what chance would remain? The conspiracy that formed against him was not made only of rigid ideologues, or only of personal enemies. It included men of different motives joined by a common fear. Some believed genuinely that the Republic must be saved from monarchy. Others resented exclusion, humiliation, or disappointed expectation. Some may have acted from conviction, some from vanity, some from dread, and many from a mixture of all three. Human motives are rarely pure, even when wrapped in noble language. Marcus Junius Brutus became the name most closely associated with the plot, in part because of his ancestry. His forebear, Lucius Junius Brutus, had been celebrated in Roman legend as the expeller of kings and founder of the Republic. That ancestral memory made the younger Brutus symbolically potent. Yet symbolism can weigh heavily on the living. Brutus had benefited from Caesar's favour, been pardoned after civil war, and entrusted with office. If he joined the conspiracy, as he did, it was not because he had been consistently excluded from the Caesarian order. Rather, he embodied the painful paradox that Caesar's generosity could not extinguish republican conscience or aristocratic discomfort. Cassius Longinus, by contrast, seems to have carried sharper resentment and harder edges. He had fought against Caesar and submitted afterward, but not with complete inward surrender. Around these men and others, the conspiracy took shape quietly. Meetings were held, allegiances were tested, secrecy was maintained. They chose not the street nor the battlefield, but the Senate meeting. That choice mattered. They would kill him not as brigands, but as men claiming constitutional purpose. Calpurnia is said to have had troubling dreams on the eve of the assassination. Ancient writers, attentive to omens, fill the story with portents, strange lights, sacrificial warnings, uneasy prophecies, a seer's caution about the Ides of March. Whether one believes such details or not, their presence in the tradition reveals how strongly posterity felt the nearness of fate. The event seemed too large to have arrived without signs. On the morning of March 15th, 44 before the Common Era, Caesar went to the meeting at the theatre of Pompey. The choice of venue was itself layered with irony. Pompey, once his ally and then his defeated rival, had lent his name to the complex. There, beneath the gaze of a dead competitor's monument, Caesar entered a chamber filled with men in senatorial dress, many of whom owed him pardon or advancement. Accounts differ in particulars, as they often do, yet the broad shape is clear enough. A group pressed around him under pretext of petition. One seized his toga, blades appeared. He was struck many times, though not all the wounds were grave in themselves. Ancient medical tradition held that only one near the chest was fatal. The rest expressed frenzy more than efficiency. This too feels psychologically true. Conspiracy, once enacted, often turns clumsy. Men who imagine themselves stern restorers of liberty discover their hands shaking inside the act. Much has been made of his last words, or their absence. The famous phrases may be literary constructions. What matters more is the image, the most powerful Roman alive, collapsing at the foot of Pompey's statue, his blood marking the base. A man who had reordered calendars, crossed frontiers, and dominated assemblies was suddenly reduced to a still body on the floor, while his killers, perhaps shocked at their own success, hesitated over what came next. The decline, if one may call it that, was not a long wasting away, but a narrowing of alternatives. In his final months, Caesar's problem was not weakness, but excess success. He had survived too many rivals, accumulated too much honour, inspired too much dependence, and left too little room for the old republican instinct to breathe. He did not die because he had failed. He died because, in certain eyes, he had succeeded beyond the measure the republic could bear. News of Caesar's death moved through Rome with bewildering speed and uncertain interpretation. Murders of public men were not unknown in Roman history, but this was something larger, heavier, and less containable. The assassins had expected, or at least hoped, that the city would rise behind them once the deed was done, recognizing in bloodshed the restoration of liberty. Instead, Rome reacted first, with shock. The conspirators emerged and announced their purpose, invoking freedom. Yet freedom is a difficult word to stabilize when introduced by violence. Many citizens did not know what had happened in detail. Others knew only that Caesar was dead and armed men were in the city. The Senate was disrupted. Officials withdrew. Supporters of Caesar feared more killings. His enemies feared retaliation. Markets, households, and streets took on the atmosphere that cities assume when authority has been suddenly punctured, but not replaced. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and co-consul, moved carefully in those first hours. He had escaped the assassination itself, and now found himself in a position of immense consequence. Lepidus, another Caesarian, commanded troops nearby. The conspirators had struck a great blow, but they had not secured the machinery of state, nor had they eliminated all of Caesar's partisans. This omission would prove decisive. For a brief moment, compromise seemed possible. The Senate, under pressure and anxiety, sought to prevent immediate civil war. Caesar's acts were ratified, preserving administrative continuity, while the conspirators received a form of amnesty. Such arrangements, crafted in crisis, often look sensible on paper and brittle in reality. Beneath the language of reconciliation lay irreconcilable memories. One side believed it had ended tyranny. The other believed it had witnessed sacrilege and murder. Then came the funeral. Roman funerals for prominent men were public events of memory and politics. Ancestors were invoked, achievements recited, the body or effigy displayed before the people. In Caesar's case, the funeral became something more powerful than a rite. It became a referendum conducted through emotion. Antony's speech, whether later tradition enlarges it or not, appears to have moved the crowd deeply. Caesar's blood-stained garment and a wax image showing his wounds were displayed. The people, stirred by grief, pity, outrage, and perhaps their own uncertain dependence on the order he had represented, turned against the conspirators. The funeral pyre was improvised in the forum. Benches, wood, and furnishings were thrown upon it. The body was burned there, amid tumult, rather than conveyed in measured procession. Veterans, ordinary citizens, and many who had benefited from Caesar's generosity or admired his greatness, now made their feeling unmistakable. The conspirators, who had hoped to be hailed as liberators, found themselves exposed and unsafe. One by one, or in small groups, they withdrew from the city and then from Italy altogether. What was mourned in those days was not merely the man, though many mourned him sincerely. It was also the possibility that the world he had stabilized, however uneasily, had just been reopened to chaos. Caesar had ended wars by winning them, distributed land, provided spectacle, forgiven enemies, and embodied Roman success in a form legible even to the poor. For those exhausted by years of conflict, his death looked less like constitutional correction than like the tearing open of a wound barely closed. At the same time, not all grief was pure admiration. Some senators and conservatives must have felt relief beneath their fear, believing the impossible concentration of honours around one man had finally been checked. Others, even if disliking the assassination, could not forget the humiliation of life under his dominance. Rome contained many truths at once, as great cities usually do. A dead ruler can be mourned as benefactor, resented as oppressor, and pitied as mortal in the same hour. His will added further force to his posthumous influence. He left money to the Roman people and made his great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, the future Augustus, his adopted son and principal heir. Adoption, in Roman society, was not a sentimental afterthought. It was a political and legal act of enormous importance, carrying name, property, and continuity. In death, Caesar thus created the figure who would eventually transform his unfinished dominance into a lasting imperial system. The immediate legacy of the assassination, therefore, was deeply ironic. Men who struck to save the Republic accelerated its final transformation. By removing Caesar without restoring the old balance of power, they created a vacuum into which new struggles rushed. Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, and the remnants of the Republican cause would soon divide the Roman world into fresh camps. Proscriptions would return in new form. Battles would be fought again. Liberty, so loudly invoked in the Senate chamber, would not be recovered in any stable sense. Even the honours he received after death reflected the city's uncertainty and longing. A comet, seen during games held in his memory, was interpreted as the soul of Caesar ascending among the gods. He was officially deified as Divus Julius. A temple was dedicated to him. This was not merely piety, It was politics transfigured into religion. To honor him as divine was also to strengthen the legitimacy of his heir, who could now style himself son of a god. Thus, the immediate Roman reaction to his death moved from fear to grief to violence to worship. Few lives close so abruptly while continuing so powerfully in public imagination. His enemies removed his body from the world, but they could not remove his presence from its institutions, its calendar, its literature, its armies, or its future rulers. In some respects, they made him larger. There are many ways to remember Julius Caesar, and history has used almost all of them. He has been cast as republican destroyer, military genius, literary master, ambitious aristocrat, pragmatic reformer, seducer of cities, giver of clemency, enslaver of peoples, architect of transition, and warning against personal rule. None of these portraits is wholly false. None is sufficient on its own. His life stands near the center of one of the great political transformations of the ancient world. Before him lay the Roman Republic in its old language of annual office, shared aristocratic competition, ancestral restraint, and civic liberty, though by his time these ideals were already badly strained. After him lay the Roman Empire, though not yet under that name, shaped formally by Augustus, but made possible in large part by the precedents, crises, and concentrations of power Caesar had embodied. He did not build the final imperial house by himself, but he removed many of the walls that had once prevented it from being built. What remains especially striking is the combination of his talents. Many conquerors can fight, but few can write. Many politicians can flatter or manipulate, but few can move from courtroom speech to camp logistics to urban reform with equal confidence. Many reformers understand institutions, but fewer possess the charisma to command soldiers and crowds as well. Caesar brought these gifts together in one life, and that is one reason his shadow is so long. He was not memorable for one excellence alone. He was memorable because so many forms of excellence gathered in him at once, and because they were joined to an ambition that never consented to remain moderate. Yet history is not obliged to admire without measure. The brilliance of his prose does not erase the suffering of Gaul. The elegance of his reforms does not cancel the constitutional violence of civil war. The generosity of his clemency does not remove its undertone of superiority. If his enemies misjudged what would follow his murder, that does not mean their fears were groundless. Greatness and danger can inhabit the same person so completely that later generations are still sorting them apart. And perhaps that is why he continues to feel so near. Some historical figures recede into one lesson only. Caesar does not. He raises questions that do not settle easily. How much disorder will a society tolerate before it begins to welcome one commanding will? When does reform become domination? When does admiration for competence prepare the ground for submission? When do institutions fail because one man overwhelms them? And when do they fail because they were already too weak to contain the kind of man they invited into being? For centuries, his name became a title. Caesar became Kaiser, Tsar, a word for sovereign power itself. Few men leave behind not merely a memory, but a vocabulary. And yet language, for all its grandeur, can sometimes obscure the mortal person beneath it. He was still a man who aged, who felt pressure from debt and expectation, who depended on allies, who endured illness, who misread some enemies and outmatched others, who wrote by lamplight, travelled dusty roads, listened to reports in tents, and stood in rooms where the air of politics must have felt close and heavy. In the end, what remains may be not only the empire that followed, nor the battles, nor even the celebrated phrases, but a single, unresolved tension at the heart of political life. The tension between the need for capable leadership and the fear of power gathered too completely into one pair of hands. Caesar did not solve that tension. He became its most famous ancient expression. And so his story settles where it began, in the hush after his death, when Rome had to look at itself and ask what exactly had been struck down in the Senate chamber that day. A tyrant, perhaps. A saviour, perhaps. More likely a man who had become too immense for the old order and too human for the legends built around him. The city went on. The forum filled again. New names rose, old names faded, and time carried Rome forward into another age. But the question remained, quiet and persistent, like footsteps in a portico after the crowd has thinned. It remains there still, resting softly in the silence that follows.